Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Professor.
So much has happened over the last week that it's difficult to know what to select to start with, but it seems as though events stream in from day to day at an ever faster rate. We're now told that the Chinese military presence in the Eastern Hemisphere is beginning to match the American. We're told that we can't be sure what's happening in Syria about chemical weapons, and so we can't do anything until we can find out, which is a way of staving off intervention but not saying that we're not going to intervene.
Mm-hmm.
The situation in Iraq gets worse. The 400 people were killed in April, which may be less than big American cities. I'm not sure what the latest score is in the streets of American cities, but it's certainly more than we hoped to see at this time. What else?
Don't forget Guantanamo Bay.
Guantanamo Bay, we're still trying to close.
Don't forget the North Koreans.
The North Koreans. Well, they seem to have calmed down a bit. I don't know whether they've finally begun to do what China's telling them or not.
I think maybe their internet subscription got canceled, so we can't hear from them any longer.
The euro isn't getting any better. The European economic situation isn't getting better.
Yeah, Draghi signaled today that they can foresee a time with negative interest rates.
Yeah. Well, we're not far
No, we're
short
not.
of that at the moment.
Nope.
Even though the stock market still seems to go up for reasons that are, as far as I can see, not productive.
Mm-hmm.
And then this ridiculous situation of Apple borrowing money in order to avoid bringing money home.
Correct. Correct.
Shareholders in order to get them to keep hold on to their Apple shares.
That's true. That's true. They carefully calculated that and figured out that it would cheaper to borrow the money than to pay tax on the money they'd have to repatriate from Ireland.
Anyway, it seems to me that if you look for a sort of common denominator under all of these things, it has to do with the fact that the way everyday social life is changing is the dominant factor in what's going on in the world today.
Mm-hmm.
And we depend upon institutions to do everything. And our institutions were developed in the last century, in many cases even before that.
Mm-hmm.
And institutions, because we're proud of them, don't change very easily.
Mm-hmm.
And the people in the institutions keep trying to deal with the current situation, but they're dealing with them according to the way we used to deal with new situations. It doesn't work anymore.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a question. I mean, we frequently talk about this topic, and let me just propose to you that perhaps, and I'll just pick a name out of a hat, somebody like Tim Cook, who runs Apple. All right, do you think perhaps at his level, they're already very, very well aware of the fact that the institutions have become so feeble and can't keep up with what's going on a horizontal level with the gradual increasing of awareness of all people, and that they've already adapted and are ahead of the curve, so to speak? And I mean, just look at what they've done with their global hoarding of money in various places. Look at, for example, the apparel industry with that horrible fire in Bangladesh, over 400 dead. I mean, those lines run direct to New York City and to London and to Los Angeles with the fashion industry. I mean, people in business, I think, have been exploiting these seams and using them to their advantage for some time. And if you look back a little bit longer, I mean, the financial crisis could in many ways be attributed to what was going on, in that there's these splits and seams between regulators and institutions. And we often talk about how terrorism and how other forms of manifestation of popular dissatisfaction can slip through these cracks. But I think also there might be a much more organized form of popular of reaction in this, and I think that's commerce. I think international business is doing it. One of your associates, whose book you recommended to me and who I purchased, a 2-volume book on globalization, whose name I can't recall.
Castells?
It may have been he, yes. He had like a 70 or 80-page chapter on global worldwide crime and
Yes.
crime syndicates. And he made it very clear, and I did read that chapter, that, I mean, these guys are like, hey, wow, this is fantastic. I mean, everybody's got a little slice of the pie that they have to monitor, and nobody's looking horizontally here, but we can do that, so we're just going to act in a regional and ultimately a global nature.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering if people, for example, in the executive suite at Apple or Google or Ford or General Motors or whomever, Siemens, ever watch this broadcast, they would look at each other and start chuckling and say, wow, these guys, you know, they're finally getting what we know.
Well, I think that you may be right. And I've often wondered, somebody like Tim Cook, if he's as qualified for the position he fell into as people think he is, knows that the most important thing he has to manage is public trust
Mm-hmm.
and faith.
Mm-hmm.
And so he can't appear on the outside to know these things on the inside. He's got to make everything continue to appear right on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very difficult to test this possibility.
That's true. And he has to act that way on the outside, but on the inside, he has to sit there and make the calculations to open up new production arms at Foxconn.
Mm-hmm.
He has to make the determinations to keep money resting overseas and not brought into the United States. He has to make the determination to load up his company with debt for the first time in its history to pay out dividends in order, as you know, to keep shareholders in place. I mean, it's definitely a bit of a bipolar means of thinking. I mean, and I know that this happens all the time. I know that politicians will walk from a meeting where things are being said and discussed that would be horrifying if publicly known, but then walk out to a press conference and speak the right words and portray the right image. But in this particular instance, it really strikes close to home in what we talk about.
Yes, and I think that we're part of the problem at the moment is that we're in a situation where everything is changing faster than it's ever changed before. And it's not only the issue of change, it's the issue of the size of the arena within which everything's happening, and the fact that the measure of everything within that arena is finance,
Mm-hmm.
but the figures are beyond the imagination
Mm-hmm.
that somebody had a generation ago.
Yeah.
And so nobody really commands the material to be able to think rationally about what's going on. And whether, I mean, I don't know, since I'm not in the business myself, but I suspect that people in finance who are very successful at the little bit of finance that they do.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not controlling world finance,
Mm-hmm.
which is uncontrolled.
Mm-hmm.
The relationship between currencies is not working the way it used to work.
Mm-hmm.
The dollar still works very well because people have faith in the American economy, because the American economy is continuing to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody can, and it's amazing actually that America has managed to maintain the international faith in its economy, because at the moment an enormous amount of what's going on in the whole world depends upon that.
Mm-hmm.
If that were somehow to collapse, then we would see amazing change. Very quickly.
Yeah. I did. The bottom would fall out of a lot of economies fast.
Yeah.
It's interesting though when we talk about this rising of the water that's raising all of the boats, if I may use that metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
There still remain these international news organizations, all right, global in reach, many of them, and I can recite the names as easily as you can. But yet these organizations, I mean, I know that you're aware of this. I mean, there's a CNN Asia, a CNN Africa, a CNN India, a CNN Europe, a CNN United States, a CNN Latin America, and they're all operated out of the same office building in Atlanta. And they have different announcers, different formats, but it's essentially it's different news as well. All right, it's news that is aimed at the consumer in that area. And to go back to the discussion we were having the other day about trending, I think that the news selection is certainly influenced by statistics that they gain on trending of stories, whether they be on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or however else they gain their metrics. Because they're not going to put up stories that nobody's interested in. I'm sure when they sit down and have their production meetings, they look and they say, well, okay, in Africa, for example, they're interested in the fact that Boko Haram killed 300 Nigerians in the northern part of the country. They're interested in the coup d'etat attempt in Chad. They're interested in the Chinese influence in Mombasa, in eastern Kenya, et cetera, et cetera. And then they run stories on that, and it becomes like a self-perpetuating feeding machine.
Well, I know that, I mean, what you're saying is very interesting because I know that even newspapers like the Financial Times or The Economist, which are international, are published simultaneously in different parts of the world in editions that are designed for that part of the world. Mm-hmm. The only international medium of information that I'm aware of is the BBC World News.
Mm-hmm. That's
so
true.
Far as I know, it's the same for everybody, but I may be wrong.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. All right, because
I wonder how they managed to get away with it, and whether it would be interesting to work out or to find out how they select the news that they put in their hourly headlines, apart from the things they choose to spend 5 or 10 minutes on in the course of the hour, mm-hmm. Compared to what CNN, for example, does.
Mm-hmm. Because again, and I'm going to try to check that actually, because the exposure I have to the BBC radio is limited only to my being in the United States. When I'm in the UK, I'll watch BBC television. But in the United States on BBC radio, the first 2 or 3 stories are generally about the United States.
BBC World News on the car, are they?
It's BBC World News. It's in a car. It's on satellite radio.
Yeah.
But I can't say for sure, but I'm not so sure I've seen the same watching BBC television in the UK. They seem to be starting with...
But if you watch BBC World News television...
Yeah, I have that on my cable, but I don't watch it. I may watch it tonight just to explore this further. Mm-hmm. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that on the one hand, what we're talking about with these breakup of different regional news coverages are a manifestation of the awareness that media, i.e. commerce, finance has, this is presumably all advertising generated, that they have to be able to cater to this awareness that's growing in these individual areas. But on the other hand, I mean, the mere fact that we're talking about one single medium, whether it be the radio or the TV or some sort of electronic media, means that there's a much more broad standard of information being able to be obtained, simply by virtue of the fact that that's the case. That would not exist but for this increasing awareness that's going on. And I'm wondering if the next stage, as we're going to go down the line, are we going to see just world news, like the news of the world, and it will be of the same interest to the people in Chad as it is to the people in Oklahoma. I mean, I don't know. How far can you take this? Will we reach a point where all 6.5 billion people are so interconnected that they have the same appetites for information?
Well, I think we're at a stage of development that's somewhere in the middle between what things were with just national news 50 years ago and with total world news. And I was wondering whether the BBC is in fact already there with world news, and I'm not sure about it. But I think that's the direction we're moving in. Mm-hmm. Though I think there will always be local news as well, mm-hmm. as it is now. Mm-hmm. You can turn on KYW and get local news. Mm-hmm. So I think we're as the rate of change continues to increase, more and more things which are really globally oriented mm-hmm. are emerging. And they all have to do with things that are happening from the ground up, not from the top down.
Let me ask you a question. All right, in the Middle Ages, for example, in Europe, in the early Middle Ages, they used to have these religious festivals hosted by the local bishop, and people would trek there from isolated villages for like a 2-week long festival. And it was frequently, in many instances, it was like almost like the Hajj. It was like the only time that people would ever get out of their villages and get to meet other people, et cetera, et cetera. Anthropologically speaking, this idea of the news, so to speak, I mean, how important is it to the development of humankind? I mean, for people to step outside of their comfort slash awareness slash abode kind of nuclear village unit and begin to interact with people elsewhere?
It's been very important historically. Places of pilgrimage flourished because of their use for that purpose.
Okay.
Throughout Western Asia into Central Asia, there were always, any village you were in had some connection to a market center, which people visited every now and then for reasons of trade, but which served as education centers. Something that I'm going to be talking about later this summer at an international conference explains how we managed to maintain a language as a standard language spoken and written in the same way so that everybody understood it from as far west as Bosnia to as far east as central China and as far south as southern India for the better part of 1,000 years, when you would expect it to diverge into dialects.
Right, right.
The reason was that people were sending letters backwards and forwards. They were writing this language, which was considered to be the standard for international communication. So people spoke it as well.
But and I know you're an expert and very interested in writing and language being reduced to writing and the means of communication that affords. But let me ask you a question. Before the advent of writing, I mean, I can remember simplistic descriptions of the town crier in England. I mean, were there similar, in primitive societies, were there similar news conveyances?
It's very difficult for us to be certain now what existed before writing, because everything since the beginning of writing has been reconditioned because of the... But now that we no longer speak the way we write, but we communicate in so many other ways besides written communication, I think we're reverting to a situation in which there's a growing difference between the ways different groups of people articulate. I'm having more and more difficulty understanding what my students say to me because they weren't taught to speak the way they wrote.
Right.
And I think that's going to completely change the way language works.
Which will ultimately change the way writing works.
Understand what town criers said anyway. You just understood the lilt of the voice. And I think there's a lot in that now as well. That you know, most of what we understand from other people is that we know what they're supposed to say in particular situations.
Right.
What we understand with bad handwriting is we know what we expect to see written.
Okay. So does that same, let's explore both of those roads from that. The expectations of listeners or consumers of news. All right, since we all sort of half listen to the news while we're allegedly multitasking or doing something else. So you're listening in the background to the news and the touch syllables are heard, the touch names, proper nouns, etc. And you connect and off you go to the next story or you continue to make your coffee. But what about in societies that are cut off from the news? And the one that jumps to mind, of course, is North Korea, where the news is very strictly controlled and repeated to them as it's fashioned by the ruling party. And I guess it's a question of if they've never had chocolate ice cream in their whole life, they don't know what they're missing. They don't know, right?
But I suspect a certain type of information passes around informally very quickly. which was certainly the case in the Soviet Union.
Samizdat, right, right, as well as rumors.
And for example, I'm very interested in what's going on in Iran at the moment, and I wonder how this new social media are working in Iran, because 50 years ago in Iran, I was very impressed by the speed at which news moved when people weren't using telephones, let alone cell phones. There was just so much meeting for the purpose of passing on information. In fact, the way social life worked all day was moving from one meeting to another and maybe doing a little work on the way.
Okay, okay.
So I think that from what distinguishes our species from other species is the tendency that we've always had to try to communicate and to interact with as many other people as possible.
So to go back to the Tim Cooks of the world, all right, the first users of email back in the mid 80s, all right, with regional representatives in every country, and then even within those countries, sub-regional representatives, with market analysis and market data commissioned and paid for by local experts, and then with frequent, regular, quarterly, if not monthly meetings at corporate headquarters to transmit this information upward. I mean, they could have been and could be really sitting at the top of this pyramid of data that presumably it's, as you noted, I mean, they're interested, they're not probably interested in automotive data. They're probably not interested in medical device data. They're interested in data that pertains to their business. But it really can afford them an opportunity to use all of this to a great advantage and to make a lot of money.
Well, but I think the ways of making money are changing, and probably will change faster and faster, because I don't think the data is developed in pyramids anymore. That it's very difficult to control data, but data is being created in an uncontrolled way, and it's the challenge is for each person to have the ability to access and process the data that will be useful to them.
That's true. And if you look at it also, if the corporation is interested in only hearing what they expect to hear or expect to yield from the data, reap from the data, they're going to do the same thing that multitasking person does when he or she is listening to the news. So, I mean, they really have to be responsive to this kind of organic, infinite vertical that can exist from all the 6 billion plus people in the world who are adding their input.
I find one of the biggest challenges in listening to the news, even in the car, the BBC satellite news, is making sure that I pick up things I wasn't expecting to hear.
That's very interesting.
I can't rewind and listen to it again. And so often I hear something, I thought, God, that was interesting, but where was it?
Yeah. But just what you just first said, and I'm going to do this driving home, I'm going to listen to the news, the BBC News, and I'm going to pick out, and if I can do it and not drive off the road, jot down things that I hear that I didn't expect to hear.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Yeah. How do you get a lot of that in every newscast, or some of it, or any of it?
It varies enormously. But I turn on the news and it's sports, so I turn it off again.
Interesting.
But no, I mean that's in fact, and that's particularly true of the BBC World News as distinct from CNN. You hear a lot of things that you didn't expect to hear.
Okay. I have to ask you one question before we close, and I'm sure you saw this. The news that the original English colonists in Jamestown resorted to cannibalism. Any comments on that?
No. When was that?
Well, it was the front page of the Times yesterday. They dug up a skeleton of a young girl.
But which column?
Oh,
was that?
It was in Jamestown. It was.
Which date was that?
I think they said 1609.
Oh, so
It was the starvation colony.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there have been many instances of
Well, I
cannibalism.
think I mean, somebody wrote a book proving that cannibalism had never existed in the 1980s, which was very useful because it made people come out with all the instances of cannibalism
Yes,
who did exist, and now we've
yes,
got some real data about cannibalism, which
yes,
everybody had been afraid to talk about before.
yes.
But no, I think cannibalism still needs a lot of work, actually.
One, I don't want to seem crazy, but I mean, are there other species that eat their own?
I think so,
There
yes.
are. Okay, all right. I don't want to go. I know this is a globalization discussion. Okay.
It's not not something that we need to look forward to in the future, I don't think.
No, not unless the American economy tanks and everything else goes south. All right, Professor. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to speaking to you again.
Okay,
All
well,
right.